Hello, welcome to the program. First tonight, keeping killers in jail is a vote winner, as Premier Mike Rann knows. And while his decision to keep convicted murderer Alan Ellis in jail will get the thumbs up from many South Australians, it also raises some serious questions. Amazingly, neither Alan Ellis nor his co-offender would now be in jail if they'd known that the state's head forensic pathologist had ruled their victim's death was accidental. Fortunately, their ignorance led to a confession. But what of the scores of other cases where murderers have gone free and the innocent may have been locked up? Graham Archer has this remarkable story, and with it a warning that it contains images of the deceased which may offend Aboriginal viewers.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed.
A recommendation of the Parole Board that Her Excellency the Governor approve the conditional release of Alan Charles Ellis was rejected by Her Excellency on the advice of the Government.
This is taking on the justice system, Mike Rann style.
The public interest and community safety will remain our central concern.
What we've seen over the past months is a criminal justice systems where basically the parole policies just depended on what was the best headline for the week.
No question, Alan Ellis's murder of Gerald Warren in 1984 was abhorrent, and he may well deserve to stay in jail. But should it be prison term by press release?
He's interfering in a system of due process without any process of his own. And that seems to me to be a fundamental contradiction.
And wouldn't you know it, only in South Australia can the government overrule the Parole Board. Head Francis Nelson QC accepts that law, but questions the motives.
I think my concern is that this is only one of a couple of decisions which attracts the headlines and detracts from the fact that there are areas where I really think the government should be doing something more for public safety.
And while the Premier dismisses our questions about breaches in due process in the criminal justice system, he's happy to indulge in a spot of it himself. First, tipping off the Tizer for maximum splash.
It seems unacceptable for a Premier or a government to arbitrarily overturn decisions of the Parole Board. It could appear to people as if it's some form of tabloid political grandstanding.
But now Mike Rann's raised the Gerald Warren murder case, let's see how genuine he is about fixing failings in the justice system that have actually let murderers go free.
Now, whilst I have no reason to suggest that the Parole Board has not done its job properly, we have very, very clear reasons to suggest that other parts of the justice system have failed.
For a start, it's pure fluke the killer the Premier has taken such an interest in is in jail at all.
Do you think the Premier knows that Gerald Warren's murder would never have been investigated if it had been left to the state's chief pathologist at the time?
Well, first of all, he should know, because we have explained that to his Attorney General. If he doesn't know, then clearly they're not communicating very well with each other. If he does know, then I think it's quite disgraceful that he hasn't looked into that part of this particular case.
Research by former Adelaide Uni Associate Law Professor Bob Moles and others reveals that according to the state's 30-year Chief of Forensic Pathology, Dr Colin Manock, no murder ever occurred.
In his autopsy report, Dr Manock said that Gerald had fallen out of a moving vehicle whilst he was intoxicated, and that was the cause of his death.
It was as simple as that?
That's right.
Just an accidental death?
Yes, or at least an explanation consistent with accident, yes.
Dr Manock attended the scene when young Gerald's battered body was found on a dirt road on the outskirts of Port Augusta. And this is the autopsy report he produced.
In my opinion, the deceased received his injuries as a result of leaving a moving vehicle. I could find no evidence which would allow me to speculate on how he left the vehicle, except that he had a high alcohol level for a 15-year-old.
Not a whiff of foul play, and equally baffling is the state's senior sleuth's assessment of abrasions in the form of parallel lines found on the victim's face and on the back of his right hand.
When asked to explain the injuries to his hands and face, he said that these were caused by the fabric of corduroy, his trousers, coming into contact with his hands and face.
Corduroy?
Corduroy trousers.
As a result of this and other bizarre observations, the official finding was that there was no murder to investigate. in spite of the family's anguished protests.
On the autopsy report produced by Manick, there would never have been a conviction. And that means that the parole board wouldn't have had anything to look at all, would they?
In fact, it was just dumb luck that 3 years later the murderers Stephen Newdack and Alan Ellis admitted involvement and were dobbed in.
So, what really happened?
The perpetrators said that they'd first of all taken him out of the vehicle, smacked him about the head and face with a metal pipe with a thread on the end of it. Then when he was on the ground, they drove the vehicle backwards over the top of his body and then forwards over the top of his body again.
The injuries would have been significant.
That's correct.
And here are the witness statements of those admissions. First, Stephen Newdack.
Stephen told me the Aboriginal was on the ground, so they got in the car and ran over him, but his body got hooked under the car and they kept going, dragging the Aboriginal under the car. He said he flattened it and did a 360 and the Aboriginal flung out and they drove back to Port Augusta.
If the murderers had known what Dr. Manick had to say, then I imagine that they wouldn't have confessed.
And here is the witness's account of Alan Ellis's confession.
Alan, I have information here that Stephen and you picked up an Aboriginal bloke in Port Augusta late in December 1984 and killed him. What do you say to that?
I know what you're talking about.
Alan, were you involved in this bloke's death?
Yes.
How much were you involved?
I hit him with an iron bar.
How many times?
A couple.
What was Stephen doing?
Holding him.
What then?
Stephen said, "Get back, I'm going to run him over," and did a wheelie on him.
Run over him?
Yeah.
Did this kill him?
He was dead all right.
But things got even more bizarre when the matter came to court. Defence barrister Gordon Barrett QC, acting for Ellis, in trying to cast doubt on his client's guilt, cross-examined Dr. Manick. To everyone's amazement, in the face of the confessions, Dr. Manick still clung to his version of accidental death.
That damage to the boy could possibly have been caused by the body being run over by a motor car, could it?
Yes.
Or could it have been caused by the body leaving a motor vehicle?
Yes. The forces involved in either scenario are very similar.
The possible cause that you gave for those marks on the back of Gerald's hands and face was the fabric of corduroy, wasn't it?
Yes.
I take it that's still, in your view, a possible cause of those marks.
It would certainly produce a patterned mark.
So while you agree with my learned friend that those marks may have been caused, as she asked you to hypothesise, by the thread of a piece of iron, and you agreed that's consistent with that.
Yes.
But also consistent, you would still say, I think, with the pressure from the corduroy of the pants.
Yes.
You'd have no reason to resile from that view.
Correct.
So he continued to make the prosecution more difficult.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, without his scientific explanation, so-called, about the circumstances of the death, the conviction would have been much easier.
Has anyone investigated this?
Not to my knowledge. We have put the information to the Attorney General, but he said that there's nothing to be investigated.
And this is far from the only case where Dr. Manick's findings have thwarted murder investigations and possibly put innocent people behind bars. In the Peter Marshall shooting, he failed to recognise a bullet hole in Marshall's head and concluded no suspicious circumstances. And the Terry Akroditis case, where he claimed Terry committed suicide by jumping from the police communications tower at Yankalilla. Dr. Manick concluded he fell headfirst onto a concrete roof with such force to punch a hole in the 5 centimetre thick concrete bounced off and landed on the ground. Amazingly, he escaped head injuries. And Dr. Manick's explanation for the limited body injuries was that clothing protected him. Conclusion? No suspicious circumstances. And then there's the infant death cases, Kingsley Dixon, John Highfold, Kenneth Hill, Charles Stewart, and so on.
I think if any of your viewers were sitting in court, they'd want to put their hands up and say, well, could that be right? And the answer is clearly, no, it couldn't.
And if Mike Rann really wants to take on a board that hasn't exercised its authority, perhaps he should have a chat to the medical board.
Aren't they required to investigate complaints?
That's right. It's their job to supervise the certification of medical practitioners and guarantee that they're fit to continue in practice.
Despite doubtless concern from Board Chairman Dr Tony Clarkson, who says they are investigating, letters from the Board say the very opposite.
Well, they said, first of all, we have no doubt that the allegations that you have raised could give rise to findings of unprofessional conduct. But secondly, they went on to say they think it would be unfair for Dr Manock to have to answer questions about his cases years after the event.
The most recent letter says it's the families and victims' responsibility to prosecute the complaints themselves, and if they lose, they pay the costs.
The medical board won't itself go out and investigate any of the cases, and I think that's disgraceful.
And regardless of a catalogue of concerns and possible miscarriages of justice, no one, not judges, lawyers, attorneys general, no one has wanted to tackle this issue.
In fact, we can hear the doors shutting and the shutters coming down all over the town. Nobody's interested.
And while the DPP is not happy with the Premier's parole board posturing, he's more forgiving of Dr Manock.
I had confidence in Dr Manock from previous cases.
Do you still feel confident about Dr Manock now?
Yes.
And the Attorney-General is prepared to stake his reputation on Dr Manock's work while indulging in some injustice of his own, with a baseless attack in Parliament on respected pathologist Tony Thomas for daring to speak out. We await the apology. As for the Premier, well, he's not talking.
Everybody